Okay, I think we'll get started with the next segment of the program, which will cover scientific research and innovation and the role of governments. I'm going to introduce one of the co-organizers of this conference, Joanne Halperin, who is the director of the German Center for Research and Innovation. She's based in New York. Dr. Halperin has a distinguished record in academia and most recently with the German Center. The German Center for Research and Innovation is a unique entity by American standards. It, amongst other things, maintains a number of what it calls houses of science and innovation around the world, including a major presence in the United States. They provide a platform for showcasing the accomplishments of German science and innovation and promote collaboration between the scientific communities, research establishments, and manufacturing firms and other research firms around the world, including in the United States. So, Joanne, pleased to have you. And
thank you, Tom, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished speakers, Dietmar Haarhoff and Patrick Gallagher, who are going to discuss the role of government support in spurring innovation. And as you're going to see, they're going to elaborate on a lot of the points that Secretary Blank talked about this morning. So I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction of our speakers. Then they're going to give very brief presentations, and then we are going to move into the discussion, followed by a Q&A with the audience. Dr. Patrick Gallagher is the director of the U.S. Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology. He also serves as Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology, a position that was created in the America Competes Reauthorization Act in 2010 and was signed by President Obama in January of 2011. Dr. Gallagher, from 2004 to 2008, served as the director of the NIST Center for Neutron Research, a national user facility for neutron scattering. He received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. His research interests include neutron and X-ray instrumentation and studies of soft condensed matter systems. He is currently the co-chair of the Standards Committee under the White House National Science and Technology Council. Dietmar Haarhoff is professor of business administration at the Ludwig-Maximilian University in Munich. He chairs the Institute for Innovation Research, Technology Management, and Entrepreneurship, and is the academic director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at the university. He is also the chair of Germany's Commission of Experts for Research and Innovation, which he will discuss today. Professor Haarhoff received his BA at the University of Dortmund, his MPA at Harvard University, and his PhD at MIT. He's also been a visiting professor at Stanford University. Professor Haarhoff advises a large number of private and public organizations. He's a member of the Standing Advisory Committee of the European Patent Office and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board at the Federal Ministry of Economics and Technology. He's also a member, this could go on forever, you know. He's also a member of the German National Academy of Sciences Leopoldina and Acatech, the German National Academy of Science and Engineering. And his research focuses on issues in innovation and entrepreneurship, intellectual property, industrial economics, and technology management. Patrick Gallagher, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here today and hopefully amplify, not repeat, some themes that Deputy Secretary Blank raised this morning. And I thought what I would do to sort of start our discussion this afternoon, this morning, is to talk a little bit about the context of innovation and then use that to discuss the role of the federal government funding, the topic of this panel. So President Obama, from the beginning of his term in office, placed innovation squarely at the centerpiece of our economic growth strategy. There have been discussions and sort of an evolution in thinking about the role of particularly the science enterprise within the federal portfolio, but this was really the first time a president had placed it directly as the centerpiece for an economic growth strategy. In fact, if you think back 10, 15 years before, the more common way of thinking about the economic activities were that they were spin-off activities for mission-based research. So this was really a transformational way of thinking. And the President laid that out and repeated it in the State of the Union. In fact, has been very strongly talking about this through his entire administration. One of the ramifications to making this a centerpiece of economic growth is that it becomes a driver for policy formation. And so the White House released a framework for American innovation that laid out, if you will, the moving parts of an innovation policy. And innovation policy for me is fascinating because the economic argument is really a correlation argument that that we see strong, in fact, most economic growth, and can relate it back to the investments we've made in developing and innovating new ideas. And those ideas are transformed into new products and services, and that's the economy. When you start looking at how the process of innovation works, it's not that well understood. It's pretty complicated. And so laying out a strategy for innovation was done in a pyramid fashion. That's not captured in my quickly thrown together slide. But it basically laid out the building blocks of innovation, which certainly include very traditional roles like public sector funding for research and development. In fact, there was a very strong commitment there to looking at research infrastructure. But it went far beyond that. And that's what was really interesting about this policy framework, is that it explicitly brought in how did the ideas begin to move out of the research. What about tech transfer and entrepreneurship? What about the conditions in the business community to make it receptive and support? And what about the fact that the technology and innovation itself can be specifically geared at looking at national needs, driving innovation specifically to address the challenges of equitable health care coverage for everybody, or looking at energy independence and diversification, or looking at climate change. So the framework laid out a very broad, not a prescriptive policy, but a framework policy. One of the other key motivators was that while the United States remains a vibrant, innovation-based economy, increasing concern was being raised about the direction of that innovation capacity in the United States. Most people will recall the National Academies releasing the Gathering Storm report and the follow-up reports, where they cataloged some of the indicators that would seem to predict that we need to pay attention to this. And I've shown two of these here, which look at the relative rates of R&D investment compared to other parts of the world, and the change in R&D intensity as a percentage of GDP over a 13-year period, where the United States did not fare very well in terms of relative change in R&D intensity. In fact, it was that kind of logic that led the President to call immediately for a goal of R&D expenditures being 3% of GDP, and that's been a policy goal for a while. So the context is very clear. The other one, of course, is looking at trade. In the midst of a recession, you're looking at restarting the economy, and one of the concerning issues was specifically looking at the trade balance in the United States for high technology products, not the overall trade balance. This is simply looking at high-tech products. And that balance of trade went negative in around 2001 and has remained negative. In fact, is growing negative since then. And this reflects both the globalization of manufacturing, but also the fact that these innovations which were coming out of the U.S. R&D infrastructure were largely being built elsewhere. And the question was, are we reaping the full economic benefits of some of these investments? And that causes you to look at this, what I would call an ecosystem for innovation. Manufacturing is the other topic that I'm sure has been discussed already this morning. And this has been an interesting one in the United States from a policy perspective, because it has been a bit of the third rail. Federal involvement in manufacturing is often discussed in the same breath of, is this industrial policy? Is this the federal government picking winners and losers? And one of the big discussions is, why are we talking about manufacturing? The very simple reason is there's a multitude of reasons. It plays a critical role in the economy. We told you it plays a critical role in trade imbalance. It plays a critical role in defense and security in a number of contexts. But the interesting one is plays a critical role in our nation's innovation capacity. Most of the R&D expenditure in the United States is private sector, and the majority of that private sector investment is based in manufacturing-based companies. And so a lot of discussion about looking at the interplay. So from a policy perspective, the challenge has been one of what I would call how do you support a broad portfolio or ecosystem approach in sort of federal policy. In other words, this is a chain of performance problem, and the overall performance of innovation is going to be as strong as the weakest link. And that's why the framework for innovation from the administration really covered this broad spectrum of issues, from basic R&D spending, tech transfer, entrepreneurship, manufacturing, and supporting infrastructure. That leaves a very rich policy umbrella. And one of the battles you face in there is the role of the federal government in those issues, because the defining thing about all of this is that it does not live entirely in the public sector. Most of the activity, most of the economic activity is in the private sector. And so from a policy perspective, we're immediately talking about public-private partnerships. And so the real focus has been about a manufacturing strategy that embraces this feature. The president called for an advanced manufacturing strategy last summer at Carnegie Mellon, and the centerpiece of that was a partnership, the American Partnership for Advanced Manufacturing, that has been underway. It included major commitments by the administration in manufacturing-related activities, including over $2.2 billion in overall investment in manufacturing spread across a number of agencies, and new programs to support public-private partnerships in the form of consortia or institutes for manufacturing innovation, where shared collaborative research focused on industry could take place. And that really is the theme, and I'm going to sort of leave that as the parting thought, that from the policy perspective from our end in looking at the federal role, the real action is at the seams. How do we design a federal role that can work and be integrated with what's happening in regions, by state and local governments, by private sector industry, and by universities? And I think it's that communal response that's so necessary for this process of innovation to work, and the scarcity of effective policy tools to address and work in that space that I think is where, and I see my colleagues in the audience, where we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we put together an effective approach around innovation. And knowing we'll have more specifics, I'll cede the floor to my colleague here.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. You have heard already that I'm a German-trained engineer. I did a diploma, not a bachelor, and that brings us already into the debate of Bologna degrees, but we don't want to go there, of course, because some of the manufacturing folks here with a German history would, of course, please plead for keeping the diploma engineer. I do that for very selfish reasons, too. Who then got economics training in the United States at two prestigious places here, and since then my family is also half American, half German in terms of passports and so forth. I want to report to you a little bit about my activity as the chairman of the Commission of Experts for Research and Innovation. Tell you a little bit about this particular group, but also the recommendations that we have given to the German government. So I'm not a government representative. Actually, my task in everyday life is to sort of provide constructive criticism to the government. And the interesting thing here is that it's a self-afflicted fate of our government, because they sort of created this, this commission with a relatively free charter to do pretty much what we think we should do and write. That is a dangerous undertaking in some cases, but it sometimes also yields constructive comments. Over the last 5 years, we had to praise our government quite a bit because Germany has made progress in terms of R&D expenditures at the national level, setting up new infrastructure, new institutions, doing some things that expose sound and look very reasonable and have had positive impact. And I'll report a little bit about that. So we have cranked out 5 reports. They are on the web in English as well. What we have done here is essentially we have tried to take up recent issues, current issues, and there have been a lot over the past 5 years, of course, with financial crisis and so forth, but also to tackle the bigger questions of how to design an innovation system. And I want to keep in mind and recall for all of you, we're all bound by our history, by our tradition, and I'll get into that a little bit. And that means that all of these things are path dependent. So we cannot just pick out one element of a wonderful working element here in the United States and transfer that, like venture capital, transfer that without any consideration for the context. That just wouldn't work. Similarly, it's very, very hard to take something out like vocational training, and my colleague Hans-Hubert Esser will report about that, out of a context and sort of put it into a system that did not have that from the very start, that didn't grow into it and didn't have it historically. So this commission was established in 2006. It has the charter to comment and to pick its own topics, and I'll go directly rather than talking along about the members of the commission and the topics that we picked up in the last 2 years. So obviously there was a financial and economic crisis. And there was a very interesting response by the German government, namely, very similar, by the way, to the US government, pour a lot of money into things that were related to innovation rather than building roads or do other things that we may have done 30 years ago in such a situation. We talk about the venture capital market, which is a weakness of the German system. We talk about education and research. Of course, there's always an issue of how you measure these activities statistically. There is something that is remarkable and I think that is helpful to understand for the context of our discussion here, which is the high-tech strategy Germany for 2020. In 2006, the German government then set up a high-tech strategy. And essentially what it embarked on was a kind of mission-oriented R&D policy. And it called into operation the Forschungsunion, which is a consortium of members of the leading academic institutions, industry, and government. So there it was. There's industrial policy, if you want, which if I talk to a French colleague, I will always say we don't have it. If I talk to you, I would say maybe you would want to have one. So we're in between. We're in between when we talk about industrial policy, sort of a French approach and a US approach in these things, and try to define a way. And the high-tech strategy, I think, has proved to be very successful in that it brought the major players in this innovation system to one table and facilitated some degree of coordination. Now, this is not a Marxist economy now. We're talking about the big projects like electromobility, or I've heard that Energiewende now has the status of kindergarten, so it's an established English term. So Energiewende, or energy turnaround, is turning the energy system towards more sustainable energy and developing a grid that can deliver that. When you go to our 2012 topics, let me go a little bit into more detail on the core topics here. We analyzed the workings of our universities. You may know that we have had, over the last 6 years, a competition among the leading universities, excellence competition. So there's some of them that were picked out, received a lot of funding, that raised the visibility of research at universities in Germany internationally. So we were quite successful in stemming a little bit the brain drain that had been there all the time. And so that is a very positive element that fits well into this instrument box that we have seen over the last 10 years from our government. There's the issue of skill shortages and innovations. We face a demographic development in Germany that is even more pronounced than in your country, meaning the aging of our society is more pronounced, and we face a skill shortage right now. If you talk to the representatives of industry, they will tell you that it's very hard to fill jobs with the right people who have a good education and so forth. One of the problems that Rebecca Blank mentioned this morning, bringing more women into STEM disciplines. We call it MINT, mathematics, informatics, natural sciences, and technology. We have that as well. And let me point you, just as a way of promoting the discussion, to the Scandinavian countries who 20 years ago started to increase the number of women, the share of women in engineering, in the sciences, very successfully. So we're looking to that a little bit. We have, and this sets us a little bit apart, we may not have a major problem with manufacturing right now. We have a problem maybe on the other side of the economy as it pertains to startups, to the more radical type of innovation, to venture capital. So we're looking very much to the United States. In essence, we view this in our commission as a mix determination. What's the optimal mix for the economy as a whole, and not so much to go 100% to manufacturing or services or to startups or to venture capital and so forth. And I think it's fruitful to think about policies in that particular way. My commission is very much in favor of doing something that you have done years ago, namely instituting an R&D tax credit, which we do not have at this point. Maybe we can talk about that later on. And in the last report, we also talk a lot about the challenge of China, which has come up several times. And just to promote, again, the discussion a little bit, let me ask you, isn't there much room for future collaboration, except, for example, by responding to the question whether the state of the art that we have at Patent Office in 30, 40 years from now will be dominated by English as the language of choice or another language? So there is room to coordinate and to collaborate on some of these issues. I'll stop with that, and I'm looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Okay, Patrick, Dietmar, thank you for your very informative and engaging presentations. What I'd like to ask you first is, do you have comments for your fellow panelists on their presentations? Are there certain areas that you'd like to address in more detail that they discuss?
Well, I was struck by two things in your remarks. That one, our framework for approaching this was strikingly similar, really looking at portfolio and optimization as sort of the overall goal. And then, of course, we drew different conclusions about what we perceive to be relative strengths and weaknesses. But the one area that is common, again, that I failed to mention is workforce. I think this has come up in every manufacturing-related discussion we're having as one of the key drivers. And I think this has been a little bit of a surprise because, at least in the manufacturing context, there was a widespread popular view that the reason manufacturing was leaving U.S. was because it was chasing cheap labor. And what we're finding is that's really not the case. The decision to make, the siting decisions that CEOs make are a much more complex set of criteria than just where is it cheapest to produce something. And one of the overriding features that comes up with every company we talk to is the access to a talented, high-skilled workforce and the proximity to the innovation. And so that's good news for us because we think that's an area that can be a relative strength. I think it would be true in your case as well. But the challenges of finite workforce are ones that we're looking at as well.
Dietmar?
Yes, I think that there is much more in common than met the eye maybe before the presentation that I have heard. And let me emphasize again, workforce is extremely important. And let me comment on that from the perspective of the debate that we have had in Germany for quite a while. We got, I wouldn't say lambasted, but criticized heavily by OECD for a low share of tertiary degrees that we had in the country. But there was never an attempt made by the agencies that assessed that to compare, say, a nursing degree that was brought about by vocational training with a nursing degree that is a bachelor's degree. So there are some inconsistencies in, or let's say asymmetries, in the way how we measure educational attainment and how we do the statistics. And what my commission found in last year was that we should treat that really as a strength of our system, to have well-developed vocational training systems with high-quality training. But at the same time, there lies a challenge because we cannot predict very well what the educational requirements will be in 15 and 20 years. So what we need to do probably is to make the system more flexible and allow people with a vocational training degree to enter university, to obtain further training and so forth. For that, we're not all that well set up right now, so there's work that we need to do. But I completely agree, I couldn't agree more. Workforce training is a really important point. it will not prevent us from seeing that large manufacturers will have to take production to other countries. They have to do that. There are good and sound reasons. So you will have to take production to the United States, to China, to other places, and we will have to seek for new sources of workplaces of value added then. But again, if we have a well-trained workforce, that will play to our advantage then.
Yes, and I think that Mr. Esser is going to address this issue a little later as well. So, give you a little plug there. So I have a question you both touched upon, and it's also discussed earlier today. What role does the private sector play in providing guidance to the public sector? I mean, you talked about it a little bit, Patrick, in your talk, but could you expand on that?
Well, I think in the case of innovation, it's central, right? If the entire premise of innovation policy is that this is the realm of policy and public investment to support economic growth, and that economic growth is occurring in the private sector, there has to be deep touch points here. Now, they're pretty diverse. You know, the engagement with the private sector on research direction is one activity, and there's both pushes and pulls. You're looking at realms of opportunity that are opened up by new emerging areas of understanding in science, but you're also looking at the needs of industry and where technology can play a role. Critically important. In the case of workforce, you know, one of the issues that's coming up is how to work with the private sector on supporting workforce development. So a lot of this has to do with how do you create some market, if you will, so that our educational infrastructure, let's say community colleges and vocational schools, are providing the type of curricula that are needed within industry. This is the response to a changing. And so we've been looking a lot, for example, through the NIST MEP program, which is a partnership with all a large network of small and mid-sized manufacturers in the United States, working with NAM in terms of generating certificate requirements that could be used then with community colleges to develop curricula to support getting those certificates, so that there's more labor mobility and we're supplying more responsive programs. So I think, you know, that's one of the reasons this is such a challenging area, is that it's absolutely essential to have that guidance and that feedback, but you're looking at the problem from all of these different perspectives. And so in addition to having to engage the private sector, the next question is how do you distill all of that information and come up with sensible game plans based on it?
Dietmar?
Yeah, let me start by saying that in the Mickey Mouse world of a simple-minded economist, why would you need that, right? The market provides for that. Now, in the real world, that is not the case. And one of the public goods that Rebecca Blank referred to this morning is essentially some degree of coordination, because if people are working to different ends, that can be a very unhappy process. So I learned over the last 5 years that it's not simple to set up communication processes of this type. Why? Because industry, of course, brings certain interests to the table, very naturally. That's perfectly okay. And the government has to follow other objectives that do not necessarily reflect what the big players would want to see. You've heard already that we have a very, very strong sector of small and medium-sized enterprises, some of which are very, very successful as hidden champions that you don't see because they only have 200 employees, but in a certain niche they are really leading worldwide in the markets. And they are typically not always represented at the tables of policy making. So what this high-tech strategy, which I introduced to you, has been trying to do, it has been trying to set up a roundtable, a forum, where people can bring their concerns, their ideas about which innovation programs, which directions would be helpful. And I think after some very hard initial years, this is not a simple process. It could have gone completely wrong. It didn't. It has become a very constructive forum to come to policies that are productive in the long run. And as an example, let me give you the National Platform Fee for Electromobility. 3 years ago, looking very hard at the evidence. German manufacturers, German universities, German government found that maybe the technological base for entering electromobility was not the best in the country. Maybe the patents were in Korea, in China, and in Japan, and the leading publications as well. So, and the German universities found that they had done away with 20 professorships in electrochemistry, which wasn't probably very productive either. So in that situation, this national platform was set up, which has made, I think, very decisive, very productive steps, first of all, of catch up, but also to develop strengths that play to the established strengths of the German innovation system, as you would do. I mean, we heard before this morning, what do we have to do to be prepared for the future? That's the question to be answered here. So and I think in there, again, you find the OEMs, you find suppliers, you find representatives of the academic bodies, and there's very open, very hard discussion at times. And then there are recommendations coming out of that for government, and I think that has been, by and large, a very productive process.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject for a second. So Dietmar mentioned the high-tech strategy, and just for concrete examples, so the areas of focus in the high-tech strategy are mobility, health and nutrition, energy and climate, security, and communication, with the overarching strategy of key technologies such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, and optical technologies. And these are also areas where Germany is very strong. You know, Dietmar, you also mentioned, you started talking about the education sector and, you know, the collaboration. What do you think the roles of regional innovation clusters play in Germany? And Patrick, for you, in Obama's strategy, in Obama's can you, maybe Dietmar, maybe you could start on this.
Okay. There have been a number of initiatives over the past 5 years to strengthen regional clusters. And there is an initiative which is called the Top Cluster Initiative. It's a competition, essentially. So regional groups of players can apply. And they typically focus on a particular topic. I come from Munich. We have one of these clusters which focuses on personalized medicine and tries to overcome friction in the regional innovation system. The friction comes from competition sometimes to very nice universities, the Technical University of Munich and my university, fighting for talent and so forth and not cooperating all that much. The clinics may not be cooperating all that well, and so forth. And in this joint project, the attempt is made to overcome some of that and really build a leading cluster of economic activity in this field. And those clusters are available in lightweight design for automotives around Augsburg and carbon fibers. They are available in IT and so forth. So I think going to the regional level, playing on the advantages that are already there at the regional level and trying to sort of bring in the missing links, the missing elements, can be a very effective way of doing that. Mind you, this has started a few years ago. We still have to evaluate that. My assessment is that it can be very successful with a smart cluster management, with the willingness to collaborate. But it's a novel element that came in just recently.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I think you know, the regional innovation clusters are playing a central role in the policy, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is they're the natural point of integration. This is where all the moving parts come together. And so you know, if you're trying to address this portfolio question, that's the natural thing to sort of then look at, is how do you bring disparate federal programs into coherence to support a regional manufacturing strategy or regional economic development strategy or regional innovation strategy. And often that allows you to align, let's say, R&D investments with infrastructure, with small business assistance, with training and so forth, and the whole is really greater than the sum of the parts. So we find it very compelling, and it's been a central theme in both energy-specific issues, for example, e-hubs, where we're looking at creating regional infrastructures around certain tasks, and more broadly, the Economic Development Administration within Commerce has been looking at how do you bring together multiple agencies to again, have these joint agency calls around regional clusters. The other reason I think clusters are so important gets to this issue of industrial policy. I think without clusters, the federal government's role is going to end up being limited into areas where the overriding national need allows it to sort of play a role. So historically in defense or energy or other specific mission areas where everyone understands where the federal investments can be broader or deeper. Once you get beyond that, it raises these questions, what's the role there? But if the federal government is simply supporting regionally identified focal areas, the regionally identified strategies, that's a perfectly natural role for the government to do in terms of supporting economic development. So it kind of turns the table in the sense that it's being supportive of the focus that's been decided by the region in terms of leveraging their comparative advantages and their strategies. And as long as you don't get into unusual competition relationships between regions, I think that's an appropriate strategy to pursue. So I think it has a lot of upside, and it's been essential.
I'd like to add something to that, which I think is implicit in what you said. I mean, as in the United States and Germany, we have to do with two levels of government, the federal and the Länder. And at least in the case of these cluster initiatives, I think there has been a relatively fruitful collaboration. I mean, sometimes these two levels generate friction because the federal level usually asserts thematic leadership, and the states are then in a follower role, just essentially complementing the policies that are made at the federal level. And by the way, that is complicated in Germany by the fact that we have a third level, the European level as well, because the European Commission, of course, wants to have its own innovation policy as well, and it should be entitled to that. But that makes coordination a little bit difficult. I think once you have the regional interest as sort of a focusing lens, that can work really well. Yeah. It's much more difficult in other areas.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Okay, yes. Why don't we start over here? So, do we have a microphone?
Coming back to some of the discussion earlier in the morning session, how does your innovation, both countries' innovation policy, address skill shortages? And so is there money, a program that goes to innovating in education or in subsidies to children that would naturally turn into engineers?
So I think this is probably a place where you're going to see some differences just because the structures are different in our two countries. The federal government is not the layer of our public sector that runs schools, right? So it's definitely a supporting role here. And the way that support takes place is multifaceted. So the president has laid, for example, a focus on STEM education as a key underlying enabler to all of this. And again, aligning efforts to promote STEM education, whether that's through the NSF and research-related funding, or whether that's through the Department of Education in terms of enabling technologies and educational infrastructure and grants and so forth. So that's sort of a key driver. The other one is government as convener. It is one of the public benefits there, where government can basically bring parties together in a coherent way. And that's the nature of these partnerships, where we can act in concert with industry to help define training needs, and then use that to bridge the gap to create some alignment by vocational schools, community colleges, and other trainers to meet that need. So it's a pretty broad range of issues, but since we don't run and operate the schools, it's a different approach.
Again, I think we have similar issues. Federalism in Germany essentially makes the states, since 2006 at least, since we have federalism reform, the sole owners of the process that guides the curricula and so forth for schools. Now, we're in the process of rethinking that a little bit. We had that reform in 2006 because 90% of all lawmaking, decision-making had to go through both chambers of the German government, the German legislative. And now we have discovered that giving all the responsibility to the states leads to some kind of fragmentation, where we suddenly, in all of the 15 or 16 country Länder, we have separate language assessment tests, and comparability suffers tremendously, and we have different school names and types and so forth and so forth. So there's a discussion going on right now whether we did the right thing at that particular moment, and I don't want to preempt the discussion. The federal government has been trying to facilitate the process, but it cannot simply enter large-scale projects here. That is at the state level right now. We have exemptions for that for tertiary education, where, for example, this excellence initiative to promote the level of excellence in research at universities was a joint project by the Länder and the federal level. I think what we have seen over the last years is very clearly that the returns to primary education, early childhood interventions and so forth is clearly acknowledged in Germany, but we're sort of stuck right now in this legislative problem and need to make progress there.
Okay, we have a question over here, here, and then here. And please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Michael Lawman from Charlotte again with CPCC. This is a very interesting discussion about innovation in Germany and innovation in the United States. I have a great interest, and I expect others do as well, about opportunities and initiatives for innovation between Germany and the United States. Collaborations, partnerships on issues like the Energiewende, for example. I mean, I have every confidence that Germany will solve the Energiewende, the challenges of the energy turnaround, and become a world leader in new technologies and products in renewables and smart grid that you will export to the rest of the world. Between now and 2035, the United States is expected to add over 225 gigawatts of additional generating capacity, and all that has to be integrated into a new smart grid, and all of that, and 30% plus of that is supposed to come from renewables and sustainables. So it seems to me that Germany and the United States, as in many cases in the past, are natural partners in this innovation sector. And I wonder what ought to be done or should be done at the federal level in both countries to promote this kind of transatlantic partnership, this German-American bridge on energy policy and innovation.
So I absolutely agree with you. I think it's an area rich with enormous opportunities. There's enormous synergies between Germany and the U.S. in this area, and a great deal of alignment of interest, which makes it easy to seek collaboration. And in fact, there's a lot going on. We've been involved in a number of discussions through, for example, the NIST Smart Grid effort, working with the EU community and Germany in particular to seek joint activities where, for example, the standards framework for this global smart grid infrastructure is as global as possible, so that manufacturers making these products are going to be able to sell and have access to these worldwide markets, that regulatory schemes are harmonized and things of that type. There's discussions at the research level where we try to create alignment between priority sets between the United States and Germany, or the United States and the EU. And the one interesting area of collaboration that's been very active for us is looking at Germany as a role model. We are actively looking at what Germany has done in, for example, joint research infrastructure and institutes as a model for not necessarily, as you said, a carbon copy where you plunk it down, but what are the best practices we can learn from that, and what parts of it are amenable here? What about what's happening in apprenticeship-based training and workforce development in Germany that would really make sense here? And I think that's another rich area of opportunity, what you would call the policy collaboration, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I agree wholeheartedly. There's huge potential there. Mind you, we should keep in mind that what looks like a grand strategy also has its risks, right? So Energiewende does not, it's like Ulysses tying himself to the mast and saying, okay, we will no longer use nuclear energy, and we bet that the other type of energy that will be about and will be there. I'm optimistic. I see tremendous opportunities for collaboration. I think 2 years ago, the American, US government, the German government established a new platform, an innovation platform, to talk about these issues and to come up with joint initiatives. I think there's tremendous need and opportunity, not just between the United States and Germany, to talk about avoiding duplication in basic R&D, because the mission orientation that you heard, communication, safety, nutrition, health, and so forth, that is being pursued in all countries right now. These are basic needs of our societies. So it's probably thinking about that as a competitive framework is not the right way. We should think about collaboration there. And the last point that my colleague just made, standardization, is extremely important because I think, and that came about in our discussion of China as a challenge, do we want standards that are strongly impacted by industrial policy concerns by large countries, or will we be able to open these standards so that we can compete on the quality rather than on the muscle power of the government that is behind those standards? I think that's a joint objective here, and that is a huge concern for any corporation that I've ever talked to doing business in Asia, for example.
And Patrick mentioned different models, and one I would just like to briefly I'm not going to talk about because we have limited time, but is the Fraunhofer Model. You can find a very detailed PowerPoint presentation on the ITIF website. Stevie Zell is also here. They have that on their website. We did an event with them in the German embassy in October, and all of the presentations for that about the Fraunhofer Model are on that website. Okay, we had a question over here.
Hendrika Koo with the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. One thing, thanks so much, it was a fascinating discussion. One thing I was struck by is that there is no reference to access to raw materials. Is that not a challenge?
Yes, it very much is a challenge. All you have to do is wander into the Congress any day, and there's a lot of discussion about access to raw materials these days. Yes, I mean, the one interesting thing about innovation, of course, is that this is all happening in the global context. That's true on the idea side of this in terms of the collaborative environment for world science. This is certainly true on the manufacturing. These are global supply chains and global interactions, and that's the way it is. And I think policies are struggling with how to accommodate a national construct policy to deal with the reality of these global. The markets are global. Standardization is a good example where our response is to address the fact that these things all need to work. And so the commodity issue comes in immediately, because if you create big imbalances in that and that becomes a leverage point, then it creates imbalances in the system. And you're seeing that from a couple of perspectives. One is, how do you respond to these policies to try to create access? In some cases, it's fresh looks at how do you diversify access to these critical raw materials. In some cases, it stimulates innovation to how do you maybe replace those materials so you're less susceptible to these type of disruptions. In that sense, it even gets related to sustainability issues, because in the end, all of these resources are finite. And the whole process is going to be, how do you manage finite resources to produce maximum value add? And so in some ways, it's kind of built in. And I think, but yes, it's very much an active discussion.
So just to explain, this list is not exhaustive. And yes, we have discussed that, especially, of course, in Germany. This debate pretty much came up in the context, again, of electromobility, future battery concepts, lithium-ion, and subsequent generations of energy storage. And it has raised concerns. There are some computations around that say that replacement and recovery could be a big part of a system that deals with the need for raw materials, rare earths, and so forth. So in Germany, efforts to do that have been stepped up. In this case, actually, the market is reacting very nicely. So there's a lot of private initiative to recollect cell phones and so forth, which contain a lot of the stuff that we are after there.
So we had a question over here.
Thank you. Hans Müller. I represent the Association of German Engineers. My comment, however, is based on my industrial experience with DuPont in materials for the electronics industry. The basic research is a relatively small component of the total cost of developing a new product, bringing it to market, and demonstrating the type of defect rates that are required nowadays, 1 in a million or so. It is something that cannot be demonstrated in a laboratory, bench test, or environment. It gets very expensive because you, in essence, have to make millions of these things, pounds or whatever, and demonstrate that you can reliably produce it, which links us to the manufacturing experience and know-how that is there. It's not just the investment, it's the the experience that you have gained in producing similar products over years, delivering them reliably to your customers. And my question is, what can be done in the course of this innovation chain to lower this last very expensive hurdle when in some cases we do not have the manufacturing experience anymore, and I'm thinking of flat panel displays just as an example.
So I think your comment for me just reaffirms the point that we've identified as well, which is that manufacturing and innovation capacity are completely linked. What's challenging, of course, is that the participation or the funding is mixed as you go through this cycle. And so what you don't want is for there to be unnatural seams in the process simply because the nature of the money changes or the nature of the participation changes. And I think that's where the real policy question is. If you leave that alone, what tends to happen is they phase separate. And you end up with high boundaries between, let's say, federally funded or publicly funded basic research and then what's happening in industry. And when those efficiencies become quite large, those boundaries become rigid, then I think you really lose an enormous amount of capacity. In fact, you may not even know everything you're losing. So a lot of this has been, that's specifically why we're talking about institutes for manufacturing innovation. How do we create an infrastructure that really is a compelling place where some of that public sector funded R&D can live alongside the companies that are doing the scale-up problem and taking that to what are another rich set of research questions and engineering questions, and how do you turn this into a viable market product? Because if that doesn't happen, then we're not going to realize all the economic benefits. So I couldn't agree with you more that that's the critical issue.
I think your comment raises two very interesting aspects, and they have been named already. One is sort of linkages. How do you bring the public and the private sector together? How do you make sure that the knowledge that is being generated somehow finds an application and generates value for society as a whole? Within the context of this high-tech strategy, some new policy tools were introduced into the German context, where even from the German Science Foundation you can now get money in order to demonstrate the viability of your concept for an industrial application. That is completely new. That wasn't there before. Essentially, the German Science Foundation used to be more of an ivory tower and say, well, application, that's something everybody else does, but not us. The other aspect is, what do you lose if you lose manufacturing? And you pointed to the knowledge, the deep knowledge that you have that is not protected by patents. So this is not an IP issue. Let me ask all of you, let's not harp that much on the patent system, okay? It has its importance, but we may overestimate it, okay? The largest share of innovations is not protected by patents. The critical knowledge that we get when we talk about manufacturing is in the heads of the people. That's why we're better off with long tenure at the respective company and not with a fast hire and fire mode, because the knowledge gets destroyed otherwise. And I think that will be my hypothesis, and maybe we can discuss this, is that in an economic system where the cyclicality is not that strongly developed, and that is a disadvantage and an advantage for Germany. In the context of manufacturing, it's an advantage, because we retain that knowledge in the companies, rather than having lots of startups spin out at the same time. So I think that's very important, how you can create and how you can maintain that knowledge. And it may simply be that in the manufacturing industries, we need a different model from an industry where you have lots of startups, venture capital, and so forth. The critical question for me, as chairman of that commission, is what's the right mix? Okay, there's a certain mix here in the United States, there's a certain mix in Germany. How can we improve those mixes?
Okay, we had a question here. Second row.
Over there.
Hi, Arun Vora, Mini LLC, Bethesda, Maryland. A small startup R&D company. We've been in business for about 4 or 5 years. My question to the US side is, and also to the German side is, before you have workforce development, you've got to have a product. Before you have the product, you've got to have R&D. You've got to have prototypes. You've got to make prototypes, multiple prototypes. And for a small R&D company, to make the prototypes is very expensive because On one project we're working right now, I've redesigned the thing at least 20 times. Each time I make a prototype is very expensive. Is there any way that the US and or Germany have you set up any kind of centers for prototype innovation where I can use a CNC machine? I can use a 3D printer, because for me to buy a CNC machine costing $500 is not cost effective, because I'm not going to make it. I'm just going to make the product and then outsource it to somebody who will make it for me. Then I'll sell it. Yeah. Is there anything like that coming up? I'm not talking about work with the national labs, not the universities with their high overhead, not NIST, small manufacturing labs where people like me can go and make a prototype.
So you took a lot of things off the table at the same time, but let me address your basic point. Look, there's an enormous amount of discussion about the particular barriers that small and mid-sized companies face in doing this type of scale-up work. It's an enormous concern, and it has to be addressed because so much of the innovation is occurring there. You have startup companies and these barriers that are being faced in terms of how to approach this. So we've been having the Valley of Death discussion for many, many years. We're going to continue to have it. Bridging these different modes of funding because the interests are changing is going to continue to be there. You're raising the specific question about the role of shared infrastructure and the role as to whether this leveraging can, in fact, be part of the answer. And I think generally, the answer is yes. There's a lot of feeling that some type of shared infrastructure is going to be called for. The question is, how do you put it together the right way, and how do you make those shared infrastructure sustainable? Because the money in the mixing is all those questions are still there. So there's some good examples that are ongoing now. I think in some of the emerging technology areas, in bio and particularly in nanotech, there's in fact infrastructure that's available for shared use where the tooling and the resources needed to do prototyping are extremely expensive and really prohibitive. And those are increasingly successful. I mean, we see an enormous amount of interest in doing that. There have also been shared use facilities in basic machining in terms of providing access to CNC tooling and so forth. And some of those are successful, and some of those have had trouble being sustainable. And then, certainly in the Institutes for Manufacturing Innovation, which is about a shared, less the prototyping, but more in the applied R&D space. We're going to great pains to point out that there has to be a special accommodation for the unique role of small and mid-sized companies. And so that's a clear criteria we're asking for those institutes to address. So I don't say this is the answer. I don't have that kind of answer for you, but I think this is clearly an overriding concern of ours.
Maybe I can add a little bit from the German perspective. Of course, in an economy where you have a strong mechanical engineering sector, machine tool making and so forth, that is very important. I mean, the engineering sector turns on prototyping. I mean, Dyson used to say that he did more than 300 prototypes of his vacuum cleaning device and then finally found something that was working satisfactorily. Fraunhofer in Germany provides some of the answer, especially for the larger SMEs, because Fraunhofer in some institutes to the extent of 90% is financed as a contract R&D organization. So the public share of financing is relatively low. That differs across industries. 5 years ago, the German government also tried to create a specific instrument, which unfortunately did not work that satisfactorily, which was called the research premium. There the attempt was to allow SMEs to get access to the machinery, the test beds, the laboratory equipment that you have in many universities or polytechnics, and that is typically not utilized fully. I mean, if you talk about it honestly, right? So there was the idea, let's create an incentive for these academic institutions to collaborate with SMEs. Unfortunately, that didn't come about. We now have a second generation of instruments there trying this out. That just tells you that innovation policy is also sometimes experimental and that you have to take risks. And in that case, it didn't work out well. There are two examples which I know where it works very well in the biopharma sector, which is Cambridge and in Heidelberg. That is within a cluster. And there you have enough players who have enough interest in sharing the investment cost for these facilities. So there you can find a solution relatively easily, and that works well. I can gladly give you the names of the examples. They might be instructive.
Okay, so we're moving in towards our lunch break. First, I'd like to thank the speakers. Let's give them a hand.